On April 3, 1942, at 6:47 in the morning, the first concrete foundation was poured in a stretch of rural Tennessee farmland 23 miles northeast of Chattanooga. No ceremony marked the moment. No photographers captured it. Within 18 months, this empty valley would produce more explosive material than any facility in American history. The workers who built it had no idea what they were making. The government made certain of that. If you're interested in the hidden stories of World War II, stories about the people who never made the headlines but changed the outcome of the war, consider subscribing. We uncover the forgotten machinery of victory, one story at a time. The site was called the Volunteer Ordnance Works, though locals simply referred to it as VW. The name meant nothing to them. It was designed that way. At its peak, the facility stretched across 16 square miles of what had been cotton fields and woodland. Over 40,000 workers passed through its gates every day. Most were women. Most had never worked outside their homes before. None of them knew they were handling one of the most unstable chemical compounds ever mass-produced. By the time the war ended in 1945, V had manufactured 823 million pounds of TNT. That's not a metaphorical number. It's documented in War Production Board records archived at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. 823 million pounds. Enough to fill every artillery shell, bomb casing, and demolition charge used by American forces in the European and Pacific theaters. Every single one. To understand why this mattered, you need to go back to December 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor didn't just destroy ships. It exposed a structural flaw in American war production. The United States had declared neutrality for years, which meant its munitions industry had atrophied. When war arrived, the military had stockpiled fewer than 50 million pounds of TNT, enough for 6 months of sustained combat, maybe less. Britain, already fighting for 3 years, was running out. The Soviet Union, invaded in June of 1941, was begging for ordnance. America couldn't supply itself, let alone its allies. The War Department understood the equation. Without explosives, tanks were steel coffins. Bombers carried empty shells. Naval artillery became decorative. You couldn't fight a mechanized war without TNT, and America didn't have it. The solution wasn't innovation. It was scale. The government needed to produce more TNT than had ever been made in human history. And it needed to do it in less than 2 years. That's where Tennessee came in. The Army Corps of Engineers selected the site for 3 reasons. First, proximity to the Tennessee Valley Authority power grid. TNT production required constant electricity. Interruptions caused chemical instability and instability caused explosions. The TVA could guarantee uninterrupted power. Second, access to water. The Chickamauga Reservoir provided millions of gallons needed to cool reactors and dissolve compounds. Third, isolation. If something went wrong, the blast radius wouldn't reach Chattanooga. The Corps calculated acceptable losses. They always did. Construction began in April 1942 under the supervision of the J. A. Jones Construction Company, a North Carolina firm specializing in rapid wartime builds. They were given 8 months to complete what normally required 3 years. No excuses, no delays. The penalty for failure wasn't financial. It was measured in Allied casualties. The first workers arrived in May. Most were men disqualified for military service due to age, injury, or medical conditions. They worked 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. Concrete mixers ran continuously. Lumber arrived by rail car, thousands of board feet per day, cut and framed on site. By September, the main production buildings were operational. By December, the facility was producing 300,000 pounds of TNT per day. The speed wasn't impressive. It was terrifying. The process of making TNT is chemically straightforward, but mechanically unforgiving. You start with tuen, a hydrocarbon derived from coal or petroleum. It smells faintly sweet like benzene. But inhaling it causes dizziness, nausea, and in prolonged exposure, liver failure. The workers didn't know that. Safety data sheets didn't exist yet. Toluene is combined with sulfuric and nitric acid in a process called nitration. The mixture is heated to precise temperatures, stirred continuously, and allowed to react for hours. If the temperature rises too fast, the compound becomes unstable. If it drops too quickly, the reaction stops, leaving pools of volatile liquid that can detonate with the slightest friction. The margin for error was 3F. Once nitrated, the crude TNT was washed, purified, and cast into molds. It cooled into pale yellow crystals, odorless, and inert when solid. But during production, when the compound was molten and reactive, it gave off nitrogen dioxide fumes. These fumes turned the air inside the nitration buildings a hazy orange. Workers called it the glow. Breathing it burned the lungs. Prolonged exposure caused a condition known as TNT poisoning, which turned the skin yellow and attacked the blood cells. The workers didn't know that either. Not at first. The government classified most of the production data. Operational manuals, safety reports, casualty figures. None of it was made public during the war. What we know today comes from declassified documents and oral histories compiled decades later. According to a 1948 report by the U.S. Public Health Service, over 200 workers at WWII were treated for TNT poisoning between 1942 and 1945. The actual number was likely higher. Many didn't report symptoms out of fear of losing their jobs. One woman, whose name was recorded only as M in a 1979 oral history archived by the Chattanooga Public Library, described the work this way. Your hands turned yellow after the first week. Your face, too. We called it canary girls, like the ones in England. Management said it was normal. They said it washed off. It didn't. Some girls' skin stayed that color for years. The yellow staining came from the TNT, saturating the skin and binding to keratin. It wasn't dangerous by itself, but it indicated systemic absorption. If the compound reached the bloodstream in sufficient concentration, it destroyed red blood cells causing anemia, jaundice, and in severe cases, elastic anemia, a condition where the bone marrow stops producing blood cells entirely. Without treatment, it was fatal. Treatment required blood transfusions, which were not widely available in rural Tennessee in 1942. Despite this, the workers kept coming. They had no choice. The average wage at WWII was 54 cents per hour, which was higher than any farm or textile job in the region. For women, many of whom had never earned independent income, it was transformative. They could afford housing, food, child care. Some sent money to husbands or brothers fighting overseas. Others saved it, planning for a future they weren't certain they'd live to see. The facility operated in 3 shifts 24 hours a day. Shift changes occurred at 6 a.m., 2 p.m., and 1000 p.m. Each worker clocked in, changed into standard tissue cotton coveralls. Synthetic fabrics were prohibited because they generated static electricity, and walked through a series of security checkpoints. Cameras weren't allowed. Letters sent home were censored. No one was permitted to discuss production numbers, chemical processes, or working conditions. Violating these rules meant immediate termination and possible prosecution under the Espionage Act of 1917. The security measures weren't paranoia. They were calculated responses to documented sabotage attempts at other industrial facilities. In 1942 alone, the FBI investigated over 40 cases of suspected enemy agents targeting munitions plants across the United States. Most were false alarms, but 3 resulted in arrests. The government couldn't take risks. That represented too much investment, too much strategic importance. If production stopped for even a week, the ripple effects would reach every front line. Guards patrolled the perimeter 24 hours a day, armed with shotguns and orders to shoot anyone attempting unauthorized entry. The fence surrounding the facility was 12 feet high, topped with barbed wire, and reinforced with concrete posts every 30 feet. Floodlights illuminated the perimeter at night, creating a border of harsh white light visible for miles. Locals called it the glow, though they were referring to the lights, not the nitrogen dioxide inside the buildings. They didn't know about the nitrogen dioxide. Inside the production zones, the work was repetitive and precise. Operators monitored temperature gauges, adjusted flow rates, and transferred molten TNT between reactors. The equipment was crude by modern standards: cast iron vessels, manually operated valves, analog thermometers, but effective. Automation wasn't possible. Every step required human judgment, and human judgment required constant vigilance. The temperature control was everything. TNT becomes unstable above 80 C at 300, it detonates. The margin between safe and catastrophic was maintained by workers staring at gauges for 12 hours straight, adjusting valves a quarter turn at a time, feeling the heat radiating through gloves and coveralls. Mistakes were immediate. One operator, whose account was recorded in a 1947 internal safety review, described it this way: "You didn't think about anything else. Not your family, not the war, just the needle on the gauge. If it moved too far, right, you'd be dead before you knew it." Inside the production zones, the work was repetitive and precise. Operators monitored temperature gauges, adjusted flow rates, and transferred molten TNT between reactors. The equipment was crude by modern standards: cast iron vessels, manually operated valves, analog thermometers, but effective automation wasn't possible. Every step required human judgment, and human judgment required constant vigilance. Accidents were inevitable. On November 14, 1942, a storage tank in Building 12 ruptured during the night shift. The exact cause was never determined. Investigators suspected a faulty weld or thermal expansion, but the tank had been obliterated, leaving no evidence. What is known as this? At 11:22 p.m., approximately 8,000 pounds of molten TNT spilled onto the concrete floor. The compound ignited on contact. The explosion was heard in Chattanooga, 23 miles away. 6 workers died instantly, 11 others suffered burns across more than 60% of their bodies. According to a confidential Army Corps report dated November 18, 1942 and declassified in 1995, the blast created a crater 14 feet deep and 30 feet wide. Shrapnel from the tank penetrated the walls of adjacent buildings. Production in that sector was halted for 16 days while engineers reinforced the remaining structures. The names of the 6 who died were never published. Their families received letters from the War Department, standard condolence notices, but the circumstances of death were classified. The official cause was listed as industrial accident. No details, no further inquiry. The facility resumed operations on December 1. Production quotas were increased. The Army needed more TNT. The workers understood. They went back. By mid-1943, V was producing over 500,000 pounds of TNT per day. To achieve this, the workforce had expanded to 42,000, making it the largest employer in Tennessee. The demographic makeup was striking. 55% women, 30% men over 40, and 15% African-Americans, many of whom were assigned to the most dangerous tasks in the nitration buildings. Segregation was enforced throughout the facility. White and black workers used separate entrances, break rooms, and restrooms. The justification, according to internal memos, was operational efficiency. The reality was simpler. It was 1943. Tennessee was still Tennessee. Despite segregation, the labor was integrated in one respect. Everyone faced the same chemical exposure. TNT doesn't discriminate. It poisons indiscriminately. By 1944, the medical clinic at V was treating an average of 200 cases of TNT poisoning per month. Symptoms ranged from mild nausea to severe hepatotoxicity. Workers with advanced poisoning were quietly discharged and sent home. Some recovered, many didn't. There were no workers' compensation programs, no long-term health monitoring. Once you left V, you were forgotten. One case documented in a 1946 medical journal published by the American Journal of Industrial Medicine described a 29-year-old woman identified only as patient LH. She had worked at V for 14 months primarily in the purification unit. By July 1944, she was experiencing chronic fatigue, yellowing of the skin and eyes, and unexplained bruising. Blood tests revealed severe anemia and liver damage. She died 6 weeks later. The attending physician noted that her symptoms were consistent with acute TNT toxicity, but the employer was not identified in the published case. It didn't need to be. Everyone in the field knew which facilities matched that profile. Despite the human cost, the production continued because it had to. By 1944, the war had entered its most intense phase. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June required unprecedented quantities of ordnance. Every artillery shell fired during the D-Day bombardment had been filled at WWII, one of the 3 other TNT plants operating in the United States. The bombs dropped on German industrial centers, the naval mines deployed in the Pacific, the demolition charges used by combat engineers, all of it traced back to facilities like V. The scale becomes comprehensible only when broken into smaller, more human numbers. In 1944 alone, V produced 396 million pounds of TNT. That's 1.08 million pounds per day, 45,000 per hour, 750 pounds per minute. Every 60 seconds, enough TNT to destroy a city block rolled off the production line was loaded onto rail cars and shipped to munitions depots across the country. The workers understood the numbers abstractly, but not their meaning. They didn't see the artillery shells landing in the Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge. They didn't watch the bombs fall on Dresden or Tokyo. They saw yellow crystals cooling in molds. They smelled sulfur and toluene. They went home each night with stained hands and aching lungs, knowing only that what they made was needed, and that need justified everything. The disconnect between production and consequence was intentional. The army understood that morale depended on distance. If workers dwelled too long on the purpose of their labor, on the burning cities, the torn bodies, the mathematics of mass death, production would slow. So the work was compartmentalized. You didn't make TNT. You monitored a gauge. You transferred liquid from one tank to another. You poured crystals into molds. Each action was technical, isolated, stripped of meaning. The meaning came later in letters from overseas, in newsreels at the local theater, in the faces of soldiers returning home who never spoke about what they'd seen. Some workers tried to imagine where their TNT went. One woman interviewed in 1989 for an Appalachian oral history project remembered calculating that a single day's production at V could fill 200,000 artillery shells. She pictured them lined up row after row stretching to the horizon. Then she stopped picturing it. You couldn't think that way and keep working, she said. You had to make it not real, just powder and crystals, just another shift. The psychological cost was rarely discussed. There were no counselors at V. No support systems for trauma, guilt, or moral conflict. You worked, you went home, you came back the next day. If you couldn't handle it, you left. Someone else took your place. By 1944, employee turnover exceeded 40% annually, one of the highest rates in wartime industry. Most cited health reasons in exit interviews. Some were truthful. Others simply couldn't reconcile what they were making with who they believed themselves to be. One chaplain assigned to V in late 1943 kept a private journal that was later donated to the Tennessee State Library and Archives. In an entry dated January 12, 1944, he wrote, "The workers come to me asking if what they do is sin. I tell them it is service, but I see the doubt in their eyes. They know the difference between making tools and making death. I pray I'm giving them the right answer. I pray God understands the necessity." By 1945, the war's trajectory had shifted. Germany surrendered on May 8. Japan, though still fighting, was collapsing under sustained bombing and naval blockade. The demand for TNT began to decline. V reduced production in June. Shifts were cut from 3 to 2. Workers were laid off in phases, starting with those hired most recently. By August, when Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, V was operating at 30% capacity. The facility officially closed on November 1, 1945. The equipment was dismantled. The buildings were either demolished or repurposed. The land, now contaminated with residual TNT and heavy metals, was left largely abandoned. The workers dispersed. Some returned to farming. Others moved to cities seeking new employment. A few stayed in the area, living within sight of the place that had employed them, poisoned them, and defined 3 years of their lives. In 1949, the federal government conducted a soil and water assessment of the former vow site. The results, published in a limited circulation Army Corps report, found elevated levels of TNT, toluene, and nitroaromatic compounds in the groundwater. The contamination extended over 400 acres. Recommendations included restricting residential development and monitoring local water supplies. These recommendations were largely ignored. By the 1960s, residential neighborhoods had been built within a mile of the contamination zone. It wasn't until the 1980s, following the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency's Superfund program, that the site was formally designated for environmental remediation. Cleanup efforts began in 1983 and continued for over 2 decades. The contaminated soil was excavated, incinerated, or chemically neutralized. Groundwater was treated using activated carbon filtration. The cost exceeded $120 million. The process was completed in 2006. The land, once responsible for arming the largest military mobilization in history, is now a managed wildlife habitat. The remediation revealed the full extent of the contamination. Engineers excavated over 400,000 cubic yards of soil, enough to fill 40,000 dump trucks. They discovered buried waste pits containing rusted barrels of sulfuric acid, toluene, and undetonated TNT residue. Some barrels had corroded completely, leaking their contents directly into the soil for decades. Groundwater samples taken in 1984 showed TNT concentrations of 840 parts per billion, nearly 170 times the EPA's safe drinking water standard of 5 parts per billion. The health effects on nearby residents was studied in a 1991 epidemiological survey conducted by the Tennessee Department of Health. The study examined cancer rates, birth defects, and chronic illnesses in populations living within 2 miles of the former vow site. Results showed elevated rates of liver disease and certain blood disorders, though researchers cautioned that proving direct causation was impossible due to confounding variables. The study was published in the Journal of Environmental Health, but received minimal media attention. By then, VOW had been closed for nearly 50 years. Public interest had moved on. What remains of VOW today are fragments, a few concrete foundations, rusted rail spurs, and the memories of those who worked there. Most of the workers are gone now. The last known survivor, a woman named Clara Bishop, who worked in the casting unit from 1942 to 1944, d.